It's Ron Reader digs the universe. I'm Ron Reader, and this is Ron Reader Digs the Universe, and tonight, Palestine and Israel. It must first be understood that the mainstream American understanding of this topic is incoherent. It's religious strife, a war that's been going on for thousands of years. Both Palestine and Israel do bad things. Crazy Arabs, crazy Muslims, Holy Land, yada yada yada, and oil. And that's why we should all support Israel. A nonsensical mess of ideas, some true, some false, and the conclusion, if that's what we're going to call it, is that we must always support Israel. Now, pulling away a bit from the American mainstream, but not too far, because this is a point of view that greatly sways and influences mainstream opinion on Israel, are the evangelical Christian Zionists and their apocalyptic end times mythic future history narrative, a sort of a Lord of the Rings fantasy story with orcs and goblins and a dark lord and Gandalf with a sword, Jesus with a sword, and suddenly it is downright sinful not to support Israel. Ironically, the end times narrative ends with 2/3 of all Jews being thrown into the fire pits, but we don't talk about that too much. Working very successfully behind the scenes here in the United States is AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, a lobbying group they say is more powerful than the NRA, Big Pharma, and Big Oil put together, which shepherds pro-Israel legislation through Congress and relentlessly pushes the notion that any and all criticism of Israel is tantamount to anti-Semitism. Of course, that's nuts, because a nation state is a power actor on the global stage, not an ethnicity or a religion, and therefore must be criticized, as we do with all other nation states. But thanks to AIPAC's tireless efforts, a lot of people think saying anything bad about Israel is racist. So it's a totally fucked up conversation we have on Palestine and Israel here in the United States. Just enough confusion to keep us doing anything but continuing to support Israel no matter what. It is as surreal as it is horrifying. The reality is actually very simple, not confusing at all. You don't even really need to know a lot of history. Suffice it to say that the entire region, many years ago, right before I was born and for some years after I was born, was once united in the goal of militarily wiping out Israel. But thanks to some brilliant and daring Israeli military strategy and eventually a lot of financial support and arms sales from the United States, Israel won. American-led diplomacy in the region sealed the deal. There is now no longer any real military threat to Israel in the Middle East. And don't start talking to me about Iran's nuclear weapons program. The only reason Iran wants nukes is because Israel already has them, which is provocative by its very nature. Anyway, as part of the overall Arab-Israeli war, Israel occupied the Palestinian territories in 1967, Gaza and the West Bank, and that occupation has always been understood as part of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. But there is now no wider conflict. Internal far-right extremist Israeli politics makes abandoning Palestine impossible. So Israel won't leave, and for 20 or 30 years has had, longer than that, going back to 67, my age, 53 years, has had no idea what to do with the Palestinians, making Israel default to a policy of induced misery for Palestine, desperately hoping they will leave, but they have nowhere to go, and in any case don't want to leave because this is their land. These are their homes. It's totally, utterly, completely fucked up. Israel literally occupies Palestine, and it's quite an oppressive occupation at that. It is an occupation that serves no wider security purpose. At this point, it is about stealing land and water and enforcing a Holy Land equivalent of our own shameful trail of tears on an indigenous population, and nothing more. Of course, Hamas fires rockets into Israel. Israel has made them desperate with nothing to lose. You want to end the terrorism? Get Israel the fuck out of Gaza and the West Bank. Israel, in the end, provokes all this shit. And, it is wrong even to call it terrorism. As an occupied people, as an oppressed people, Palestine has every right to defend itself. There will not be peace until Israel stops waging war. This dreadful state of affairs is a moral albatross around our necks. As Israel's strongest and greatest supporter, we are complicit to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. At any time we like, we have it within our power to leverage that support into some real and lasting impact on how Israel treats Palestine. But we don't. Our fucked up discourse always leads to support Israel, no matter what. And the American soul becomes ever more corrupt. I'm Ron Reeder, and this has been Ron Reeder Digs the Universe. Join me, Ron Reeder, again next week for another episode of Ron Reeder Digs the Universe. And their apocalyptic end times mythic future history narrative, a sort of a Lord of the Rings fantasy story with orcs and goblins and a dark lord and Gandalf with a sword. Jesus with a sword.